The Old Republic era is the origin story behind the Jedi, the Sith, and the long cycles of rise and collapse that shape the galaxy. Tracing its complete timeline matters because it shows not just who fought whom, but how institutions, religious orders, political federations, and military hierarchies formed, fractured, and handed down habits that repeat for millennia. The real question is less which battles were won, and more which structures survived to shape later ages. To get at that, we begin at the deep origins. Small, dispersed groups first learned to sense and shape the Force, developing distinct philosophies and practices. Those early discoveries produced the first schisms. Some practitioners organized into communal ascetic orders, others cultivated ambition and dominance, eventually coalescing into what would be recognized as the Sith. Parallel to those spiritual divisions, sentient species and city-states wove trade and law into wider pacts that became the Republic. The tension between centralized governance and independent Force traditions, between codified law and personal power, is what drove the Old Republic's cycles of institution building and catastrophic war. Understanding those initial choices explains why later centuries repeat the same patterns of reform, betrayal, and hidden legacy. These early choices, how people organized around the Force, how political communities bound themselves together, and how they reacted to violence, set the pattern the Old Republic would follow for millennia. To see how, we start at the level where myth and material history meet. Small, dispersed cultures that first learned to sense and shape the Force, and the practical problems that forced them into larger institutions. Long before senators and councils, there were islanded traditions of Force use. On remote worlds, groups developed disciplined ways of living with the Force. Some treated it as a tool for harmony and communal order, others as a tool for personal mastery and expansion. Where these practices remained local, they produced ritual, apprenticeship, and law, but no empire. Where they encountered trade and migration, they began to scale. Two parallel developments matter. First, the codification of Force practice. On a handful of temperate worlds, communities moved from loose teacher-student ties to organized orders. These orders wrote rules, founded temples, and established training methods that could be passed to outsiders. That shape, an institutional school with ranks, doctrine, and a set of duties, is the direct ancestor of the Jedi Order. Second, the expansion of interstellar travel. As hyperspace navigation and hyperdrive technology spread, isolated cultures connected, sending traders, envoys, and refugees along lanes that were not yet mapped or governed. Those lanes created the political pressure that turned local orders and city-states into federations. When groups of systems agreed to shared law and mutual defense, the Galactic Republic was born. This was not a single founding moment, so much as an aggregation of treaties and trade pacts stabilized by a new habit: collective governance through deliberation. A Senate-like forum took shape to adjudicate disputes and coordinate common projects. With centralized institutions came specialist roles: diplomats and jurists to make policy, navies to guard convoys, and mercantile regulations to keep commerce flowing. The Republic's first century was thus an experiment in combining law and scale, an attempt to let many species coexist across distance without constant war. The emergence of formal Force institutions and a formal political body did not eliminate conflict. In fact, it produced new kinds. Institutional life privileged predictability and precedent. Force traditions that emphasized personal authority or expansion found those constraints intolerable. The result was a fundamental schism. Some Force users accepted service to a collective order that bound power to principle. Others rejected those limits and pursued power as a means of remaking the galaxy. Over generations, that tension crystallized into two recognizable poles. On one side, the nascent Jedi defined themselves as guardians. They developed a code, monastic disciplines, and a council to prevent the personal passions of individuals from directing public policy. Training emphasized restraint, service, and an ethos of mediation. The Jedi's growth was also functional. As the Republic expanded, it needed neutral arbitrators, explorers, and defenders who could operate beyond particular state interests. The Order's moral and institutional profile made it a natural fit for those roles. On the other side, those who valued strength and dominance clustered under labels later recorded as Sith. The earliest Sith identity combined two elements: an indigenous culture with its own hereditary elites, and exiled Force users from Republic space who embraced a politics of personal ascendancy. Where the Jedi sought balance and consensus, the Sith developed doctrines that celebrated passion, hierarchy, and the use of power for control. This ideological divergence was amplified by the practical fact of exile and colonization. The displaced dark practitioners mixed with local traditions and technologies, producing a rival civilization that saw the Republic and the Jedi as obstacles. These differences mattered because institutions respond to threats by changing. Early encounters between Republic fleets and Sith forces, raids along new hyperspace routes, attacks on way stations, and skirmishes over disputed worlds pushed both sides toward militarization. The Republic created permanent fleets and a bureaucracy to oversee them. The Jedi added martial training and eventually command roles in wartime. Meanwhile, the Sith organized militarily as well, building hierarchies and doctrines suitable for conquest. Conflict over routes and resources therefore accelerated institutional differentiation. Courts and councils learned to think strategically. Temples and academies learned to fight. One illustrative outcome of this period is how legal and military innovations became embedded into culture. Arbitration became law. Fleets became a standing part of the Republic's identity rather than an ephemeral wartime measure. Jedi trials, apprenticeship exams, and a council with veto power all reflected a commitment to internal stability. At the same time, the Republic's reliance on centralized institutions created new vulnerabilities. The more decisions passed through a capital forum, the more politics could be weaponized. The more commerce depended on guarded lanes, the more tempting it was for enemies to disrupt trade. The first large-scale wars, episodic but decisive, then established reputations and boundaries. These conflicts were not merely military, they were experiments in statecraft. They answered questions about how to govern alliances, how to fund fleets, and how to justify the use of extraordinary powers by constrained institutions. Each victory and each defeat left institutional scars. Legal precedents for emergency powers, traditions of surveillance and intelligence gathering, and sets of grudges that would survive multiple generations. By the end of this formative chapter, both the Jedi Order and the Galactic Republic had achieved something crucial: formal existence. They were recognizable institutions with charters, hierarchies, and social roles. The Republic had a functioning apparatus for diplomacy and defense. The Jedi had codified training and an ethical framework that bound its members. But formal existence did not mean permanence.
The choices made in these early centuries to centralize authority, to build standing militaries, to cultivate exclusive disciplinary traditions, created path dependencies. Ancient disagreements over doctrine hardened into political cleavages. Dispersed Sith remnants, shaped by exile and assimilation, retained networks and ambitions, and the galaxy's unmapped hyperspace lanes remained an open strategic variable, offering routes for commerce and invasion alike. Those are the conditions we carry forward. Institutions now exist to hold the state together, but they have not yet learned to reconcile the deep philosophical divides about power. What follows is a longer, bloodier age when those unresolved tensions erupt again and again, testing the resilience of the systems born in these first centuries. Those are the conditions we carry forward. Institutions now exist to hold the state together, but they have not yet learned to reconcile the deep philosophical divides about power. What follows is a longer, bloodier age when those unresolved tensions erupt again and again, testing the resilience of the systems born in these first centuries. The age of conflict and consolidation is not a single war, but a rhythm: expansion, shock, reorganization, and then a brittle stability that lasts just long enough to be tested again. At the center of that rhythm are three linked dynamics. First, the discovery and mapping of hyperspace lanes turns local quarrels into galaxy-wide crises. Second, military technology and standing navies amplify political decisions into existential threats. Third, the Jedi Order's role shifts from spiritual guardians to active wartime commanders, a change with profound doctrinal consequences. Taken together, these currents produce a string of great wars and a series of decisive figures whose choices reshaped alliances and institutions for centuries. The Great Hyperspace War is the clearest opening salvo. Once multiple hyperlanes were charted, the scrap between exiled Sith and the newly organized Republic became an interstellar campaign. Powerful Sith sorcerers and warlords turned their exile into empire building. Their use of dark side techniques alongside conventional fleets exposed the Republic's early logistical and political weaknesses. It had laws and councils, but not always the mechanisms to act swiftly or cohesively across the map. The Great Hyperspace War forced the Republic to create standing military responses, to formalize command chains, and to treat remote systems as strategic assets rather than distant curiosities. The precedent was set. In times of crisis, emergency powers and centralized command would be invoked and contested again and again. After the hyperspace shocks came the longer, grinding cycles of open war between Jedi-led Republic forces and fresh Sith upwellings. The Great Sith War and other major conflicts produced the pattern that would repeat across centuries. These campaigns were not only battles of fleets and armies, they were also contests over doctrine and legitimacy. Some Jedi argued that direct intervention against endemic threats, using force to destroy aggressors, was a necessary defense of the Republic's ideals. Others warned that becoming soldiers would erode the Order's ethical foundations. Those disagreements hardened into political cleavages inside the Order and within the Senate. In practical terms, the Republic increasingly relied on the Jedi as its strategic shock troops. In philosophical terms, the Order's identity became contested ground. Mandalorian culture and its conflicts are the second major vector of pressure. Mandalorian powers were not a single empire, but a martial network that prized raids, professional soldiery, and clan loyalties.
When Mandalorian forces struck at Republic worlds or hired themselves out as mercenaries, the Republic responded by expanding military capacity and tightening control over border regions. The Mandalorian Wars in particular produced a dangerous lesson. Even when the Republic ultimately prevailed, victory often required the bending of rules and collaboration with morally dubious allies. One result was the normalization of wartime secrets, irregular forces, and covert operations, tools that would later be used politically as well as militarily. The most consequential breakdowns came when individuals crossed the threshold from defensive commander to imperial actor. A string of charismatic leaders, Sith warlords who built empires from exile, Jedi generals who embraced pragmatic ruthlessness, drove several critical turns. When Jedi stepped off the philosophical high ground and led armies, they accumulated power and influence that made them into political actors. Some used that power to rebuild and protect. Others were consumed by it. The Revan Malak cycle is the starkest example of that danger in the later Old Republic era. Military success against Mandalorians won them popular legitimacy, but victory also made them targets for dark side manipulation and self-rationalized authoritarianism. Their fall and the civil wars they triggered demonstrated how quickly wartime prerogatives could translate into personal ambition and institutional collapse. Those civil wars left durable structural marks. Legal precedents for emergency powers were stretched into templates for central control. Surveillance and intelligence operations that began as wartime necessities became permanent bureaucracies. The military-industrial relationships that developed in response to Mandalorian and Sith threats hardened into vested interests. The political center, the Senate and its allied ministries, learned how to wield power more quickly than it learned how to relinquish it. That imbalance produced recurring cycles. A crisis would unify the Republic would centralize, the centralization would breed corruption or complacency, and a new challenger would exploit those weaknesses. The other long-term consequence was the evolution of Sith strategy. Open empires, massive Sith hordes, and visible dark side regimes were spectacular and dangerous, but they also attracted coordinated resistance. Repeated defeats taught the surviving Sith a different lesson. Survival often required concealment rather than conquest. This strategic retreat is where the defining shift of the age occurs. Rather than building overt empires, Sith practitioners began to cultivate networks, puppet regimes, and secret apprenticeships. They worked through influence, subterfuge, and long-term infiltration of political institutions. The result was a corrosive presence that could survive defeats and return in moments when the Republic's centralized control weakened. This shift towards secrecy did not make the Sith weaker in influence. It made them harder to detect and therefore more dangerous over the long term. Institutional consolidation also carried cultural effects inside the Jedi Order. The repeated necessity of commanding troops left the Order with a split personality. One wing emphasized combat readiness and pragmatic strategic thinking. Another insisted on strict adherence to non-attachment and restraint. These divisions produced doctrinal innovations, new training regimens, different interpretations of Jedi ethics, but they also made the Order politically brittle. In several conflicts, whole Jedi factions allied with particular senators or regional powers, turning philosophical differences into political factions. Those rifts would later make unified responses to catastrophic threats difficult or impossible.
By the end of this chapter's span, the galaxy has been tempered by fire. The Republic endures and has become more capable. It commands fleets, manages intelligence, and governs distant systems. But it is politically strained, with legal and institutional habits shaped by recurring crises. The Jedi Order survives as a recognized guardian, yet it is battered and internally divided, its role complicated by decades of wartime command. The Sith, punished repeatedly in open combat, have learned to withdraw into secrecy, replacing overt empires with patient, corrosive influence. The age of conflict and consolidation leaves a galaxy more organized and more fragile than before, stronger in infrastructure, weaker in trust, and populated by legacies, doctrines, laws, grudges that will determine how the next collapses play out. The age of conflict left the galaxy more organized and more fragile. Stronger institutions, larger fleets, deeper intelligence networks, and an order that had learned to move troops as well as meditate. Those same changes also left the Republic brittle in new ways. Wars had normalized emergency powers. Military command had become a route to political influence. And the Jedi, once a single-minded guardian caste, had become entangled with senators, generals, and the competitive ambitions of whole systems. Over decades, these stresses opened cracks that would not be sealed. Institutional decay after long wars follows a predictable pattern. The Republic's bureaucracy expanded to manage war supply, veterans' benefits, and reconstruction projects. Because crises repeatedly justified extraordinary measures, what began as temporary presidential prerogatives and fleet mandates calcified into permanent authorities. Senators and planetary leaders learned to trade votes for protection and resources. Corruption became not simply opportunistic bribery, but a way of life in parts of the polity. Contractors, intelligence bureaus, and even legal officers rerouted money and influence to keep systems loyal. The result was a government that could command more firepower than ever, and yet could be bought, stretched thin, and manipulated by those who knew how to game its incentives. The Jedi suffered their own institutional entropy. Philosophical splits hardened into political factions with formal allies in the Senate and among regional defense forces. Training regimens and doctrine varied by temple and campaign.
creating uneven capabilities and competing loyalties. When some Jedi made battlefield command a routine expectation, others recoiled and retreated into asceticism. That divergence left the Order less able to present a single, coherent political posture in moments of crisis, exactly when coherent action mattered most. Those weaknesses mattered because the Old Republic's enemies adapted to them. Open Sith empires were beaten back again and again, and the Sith learned to stop meeting the Republic in pitched battle. Instead, they retreated and refined other methods: secrecy, infiltration, cult building, and the preservation of forbidden technologies and law. The most decisive turning points in the Republic's decline were not always great battles won or lost. They were the catastrophes that removed entire centers of power, created legitimacy crises, and left vacuumed geography and politics that clever actors could exploit. Two illustrative collapses define the late arc of the Old Republic. The first is the suicidal endgame at Ruusan. After a generation of new Sith wars, war leaders on both sides pursued a weapon of annihilation known as the Thought Bomb, a device engineered to detonate the Force itself within living minds. Its deployment destroyed whole armies and shattered the lines of both the Sith and Jedi.
The battlefield victory came at the cost of institutional continuity. Thousands of Jedi and Sith were gone, command networks were severed, and the survivors emerged scarred, suspicious, and politically adrift. From the wreckage, a new Sith strategy was born, Darth Bane's Rule of Two, which eliminated large-scale Sith empires but guaranteed a hidden, patient malignancy that would echo for millennia. The second collapse is less a single moment, a more cumulative erosion exposed in the later Republic. Protracted sectarian fights, the Mandalorian incursions, and the Jedi Civil War fractured trust between systems and between the Republic and its guardians. As formal institutions stumbled, regional strongmen and military leaders accrued power simply because they could act when the center could not. That pattern, emergency executive authority, consolidation of military command, and later, charisma-based centralization, is precisely the pathway authoritarian figures have used repeatedly in galactic history. Through these collapses, Old Republic knowledge and artifacts dispersed and took on lives of their own. Two classes of material endured: dangerous technologies and mythic objects. Technological legacies range from Rakatan constructs such as the Starforge to superweapons and battlefield devices like the mass shadow generators and other ruinous engines that scarred worlds and warped the Force. Many of these technologies were fractured and hidden when their creators fell, but pieces survived in tombs, sealed repositories, and salvage-laden worlds. Holocrons, Sith and Jedi texts corrupted or incomplete, and forgotten star charts became treasure maps for later seekers. Mythic objects had a different power. Places like Malachor and Yavin carried stories of concentrated dark side events and ancient temples. Tombs on Korriban and Ossus held teaching and temptation in equal measure. A lightsaber, a mask, a codex. These things were more than relics. They were recruitment tools and narrative kernels. Future powers could resurrect a legend to rally supporters, justify a purge, or sanctify an assassination. In practical terms, a recovered Sith holocron could teach new techniques, a recovered star map could reveal a hidden hyperspace route, and a single piece of Old Republic bureaucracy could be repurposed as the skeleton of a new Imperial office. This dispersal mattered because it turned the Old Republic's past into a resource for its future enemies. Secret Sith lines, compact, patient, and ideologically ruthless, learned to harvest those artifacts and the political chaos that followed wars. Later Sith rulers and covert cabals used relics to legitimize authority and weaponize belief. Meanwhile, some Republic veterans and fringe historians hoarded knowledge out of fear that the wrong hands would use it. The effect was a galaxy where technical capability and historical narrative both became weapons. Culturally, the
the Old Republic's collapse reshaped how the galaxy framed power. The Jedi remained a moral touchstone, but also a cautionary tale, an order capable of great service that had nonetheless been politicized and divided. The Republic became a model for representative government, and an example of how bureaucracy can both provide stability and invite decay. Myths of the Old Republic were mobilized by generals promising security, by charismatic leaders promising restoration, and by secret cabals offering certainty amid disorder. By the time the last substantive structures of the Old Republic were tested, and in many places destroyed or hollowed out, what remained were durable patterns more than intact institutions. Military command had been centralized in practice even as legal authority frayed. Sacred texts and forbidden machines survived as seeds of power rather than as public knowledge. And the Sith, having abandoned wholesale conquest for covert preservation, had become a long-game player, patient, hidden, and intent on exploiting any opening. Those openings were exactly what came next. The fractures of the Old Republic left a map of opportunity: relic-rich worlds, disillusioned populations, seasoned commanders who knew how to seize authority, and legal precedents for emergency rule. In short, the stage was set for the rise of centralized, authoritarian actors who could promise order by wielding both ancient tools and modern armies. The Old Republic's political and spiritual ruins, therefore, did not simply die away. They became the foundations upon which later regimes would build, and the dangerous inheritances that would shape every subsequent chapter of galactic history. The Old Republic, as this timeline makes clear, is less a single story than a repeating pattern: creation, conflict, and the slow accretion of legacy. When institutions fray, generals promise security. When sacred knowledge survives as seed rather than public doctrine, successors weaponize it. When the Sith abandon conquest for patience, that patience becomes history's deadliest strategy. Those are not isolated failures but templates, durable habits that shape how power is seized and justified. That is the real value of the entire Old Republic timeline. It turns distant events into a readable logic: how collapse produces openings, how relics become instruments of rule, and how precedent normalizes emergency authority. The ancient choices of the Republic didn't vanish. They became the mechanics later regimes used to remake the galaxy. Understanding those cycles explains why subsequent eras look and act the way they do.